Hello and welcome to episode number 12 of Performing Labor. My name is Rob Simons, and I am your host. This podcast features interviews with accomplished performing musicians who are doing interesting and creative work from within performing arts institutions and outside of them. We'll unpack their training, their practice and their careers, how they got started, how they stay sharp, and their ambitions for the future. And it's my hope that these interviews will provide value no matter where you are on your musical journey. If you're an aspiring musician, a working musician, or if you're a music lover and just curious to learn more. That said, this week's interview is a bit of a departure from that format, in that my guest, Karina Brown, is an amateur musician who also happens to be the Democratic candidate for Lieutenant Governor of Utah. Karina and I met earlier this year through a public administration program. We were in a small breakout group together, composed of a handful of people with wildly different professional backgrounds, and we met weekly to work through assignments and case studies. Music is an important part of Karina's identity and upbringing. She started the violin at age 5, and she's passed this on to her own children. In the interview, Karina ticks off some of the impressive stats about the economic impact of the arts in Utah today. But there's also a really interesting history of music in Utah, even before its statehood. There was an effort to bring music educators there in the 19th century and to bring touring artists there in the 20th. And I found this quote from Brigham Young, the second president of the Church of Latter-day Saints and the founder of Salt Lake City. "There is no music in hell, for all good music belongs to heaven. Sweet, harmonious sounds give exquisite joy to human beings capable of appreciating music. I delight in hearing harmonious tones made by the human voice, by musical instruments, and by both combined." When I read that, I thought of my own grandfather, Stephen Hamilton, who grew up on Vinyl Haven, a small island in Maine, during the Great Depression, and not an easy time to make a life out there. But he lived a life of books, ideas, and education. But he absolutely loved music. He used to bang out old popular songs on the piano. And while, even as a kid, he wasn't interested in the theology, I remember him telling me that he used to go to the island's different churches explicitly for the music, and that his absolute favorite were the LDS services, because they had the most energetic singing. I began this podcast during COVID-19, but not because of it. I wanted to better understand the long game of musicians I admire, and not just the transitions and adaptations during the past 5 months. But if I'm being honest, one driving reason I started this was to better understand the adaptations and transformations of artists and arts institutions over the past 4 years. And one of the few bright spots of these past 4 years has been the surge of women into American public life. And Karina has been on an incredible journey of transformation. She's gone from Republican to Democrat, from citizen to successful healthcare policy activist, and now to statewide political candidate. The author and lawyer, and soon-to-be Louisville Metro Council member, Cassie Chambers, wrote a wonderful memoir about her journey from Appalachia to the Ivy League and back to Kentucky, called Hill Women, and I'll link to that in the show notes. While working on behalf of low-income and rural women in Kentucky, she wrote how she didn't see herself as especially political. That is, until November 2016. She writes, "I realized in a whole new way that elections mattered. It wasn't enough to save one family at a time. Elections are the way you make society into whatever vision of it you have. Winning elections is how things get better." And as you'll hear, Karina expresses a very similar sentiment. She experienced something devastating close up and decided to do something about it. It's said that many Americans don't truly understand a policy failure until it directly impacts them. We don't understand the failings of the criminal justice system until we have a family member caught up in it. We don't understand the failure of policing until we see our fellow citizens lose their lives on camera in broad daylight. We don't understand the failures of prescription drug policy until we lose someone close to us to addiction. But these types of policy failures are increasingly unignorable. A different Louisville lawyer, Louis Brandeis, wrote that our founders believed that the greatest menace to freedom is an inert people. And Brandeis also said that the most important political office is that of private citizen. And while I think it's safe to say that it's a consensus American view that citizenship and politics are not synonymous, we can also recognize the enormous costs of entering public life. The unexpected candidates that don't come from what Karina calls the traditional mold have absorbed those costs and have pushed back against the complacency trap that Brandeis warned of more than a century ago. And I admire Karina and those like her tremendously, as they've chosen to not ignore what's around them. And that's why I wanted to hear more of her story and to think about how we could learn from it. I think that many of us in the fine arts recognize that our own complacency is out of step with this moment. And throughout my nearly 20 years in the business, we've been searching for more relevance. Clearly, we have to define that with more texture than we have so far. And in doing so, we also need to be on guard against a programming fallacy that both traditionalists and reformers fall into, the belief that marginal changes to repertoire will have an outsized effect. And recognizing that what can feel like a major adjustment to insiders barely makes a ripple to our intended audiences. In his book, Building Communities, Not Audiences, Doug Borwick writes, "The first step in the process of creating a more responsive arts organization is arriving at a consensus that the organization should be an active participant in the life of the community. Some believe the prime responsibility of the arts organization is to the art genre, or style, or even to specific works. For them, such a shift in focus would be anathema. But if arts organizations are going to remain viable through the century, such a shift must take place." To go back to Brandeis, he had a vision of a living law. He believed that lawyers and judges would engage in the, quote, study of economics and sociology and politics, which embody the facts and present the problems of the day. In other words, he wanted the law to be responsive. What he wanted to leave behind was what he called abstract conceptions and scientific half-truths from the previous century. And I think likewise, our institutions will not become more relevant or more living or more contemporary if we're not willing to look beyond our own cult of abstraction to something more concrete. I think there's a lot to learn from what Karina has done, taking concrete, measurable, and responsive action to make her community and her state better, even when her confidence was low, the steps uncertain, and the process messy. Karina describes herself in the interview as just a regular person, seemingly acknowledging that on one hand, she's doing something rare, but on the other, that it's possible for any American who wants to see change. And that part of her story echoed what President Obama reminded all of us in his eulogy for Representative John Lewis. That most American of ideas, that any of us ordinary people, without rank or wealth or title or fame, can somehow point out the imperfections of this nation and come together and challenge the status quo and decide that it is in our power to remake this country that we love until it more closely aligns with our highest ideals. Please enjoy this interview with Karina Brown. Karina Brown, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for making time.
Thank you so much for having me, Robert.
So you are running for Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Utah, but you are also a passionate amateur musician. And I've been thinking about this conversation and thinking about the parallels between the performing arts and running for office, and that perhaps there is no industry more acutely affected by the pandemic and the response to the pandemic than the performing arts, in that we need large crowds, in that we try and make deep personal connections. And that's so much of what campaigning for office is. And I want to hear, and you've run for office before, I would like to hear a little bit about how you've adapted to this new reality, running for statewide office in a time of social distancing.
Well, thank you for having me on your podcast. I think there's a lot of similarities between the challenges that musicians and artists are facing and that people running for office are facing. First of all, I just want to say that music is so important to my life. Even though I'm an amateur musician, I think about the analogy or the symbolism of an orchestra, and each musician plays their part and creates beautiful music. And that to me is analogous to political work, to politics, and how we have different personalities, different ideas, and that can create strength and create beautiful music when we work together in harmony. So it's been interesting to campaign during the pandemic. I mean, I was invited to be the lieutenant governor candidate in early April, and we started getting everything ready to go, and then we won at convention at the end of April. And we haven't had our first in-person real event with other voters until recently, this past weekend on August 7th. We had our first meet and greet in someone's backyard. We have been meeting with business owners and businesses, but those are limited groups, like 10 people or less, going into their business and finding out how we can help them as business owners, learning more about what's happening and the challenges that they're facing. And we've had Zoom meetings with different community members online and different interest groups. But it has been difficult to get into that transition of going to in-person events. And each in-person event that we've had starting on August 7th with voters has been 20 people or less. And so that has been a challenge. But on the positive side, it has forced us to use technology creatively. We've done Facebook Live interviews with people representing different interests, people running for office, current elected officials, and that has been very positive. We've been able to reach, I think, thousands of people through those Facebook Live interviews and shine a spotlight on different issues and things that we care about. Reaching out to minority communities, we were able to speak with a lady that works on the Navajo reservation doing relief effort work with the Utah Navajo Health System. So I feel like we've been able to adapt to the challenges that we're facing.
That's interesting. So in particular with the business groups that you're reaching out to, are you seeing that those conversations are making you guys reevaluate your original message? In other words, not only have you had to adapt technologically, but has that changed the original reason why you guys set out on this campaign?
Yes, I think so. When Chris, announced his candidacy in March, early March, the pandemic hadn't really affected us. I guess it was a couple weeks later. I mean, it was growing and growing. The threat was growing, and we've had to refocus our message on everything related to the pandemic. It's like the pandemic is the center of the issues, and education is related to the pandemic, and the economy is related to the pandemic, and healthcare is related to the pandemic. And so we're really seeing that when we've spoken with the business owners, different businesses, and speaking with voters too.
Mm-hmm. And your running mate, Chris Peterson, he has a long background in consumer protection, as you do too. So does that make you guys particularly sensitive to the needs of people and as they're trying to adapt?
Yes, definitely. That's a good point. Chris, what impressed me about Chris as a candidate was his work for consumer protection and his expertise related to consumer finance and predatory lending. Utah is one of only a few states that has no cap on payday loan interest rates, which is astounding to me that is the case in Utah. You wouldn't think that. But there was a recent article on NPR, came out of California, saying they are so concerned in California about consumer protection and predatory lending scams that are going on that they're going to form a new kind of a consumer protection office in California to help people. And so I think about that in Utah, that has had an impact because people are desperate. They're losing money because of lack of work or, healthcare expenses. And also if they come under hard times, they could be using the payday loan companies, and that could make things even worse.
Mm-hmm. So going back to your analogy of the orchestra and the political body, do you see that as you take a campaign on the road, that in this environment, you're trying to sell your ideas and you're also catering them to your potential constituents? I think in the same way that an artist, you have the vision in your mind, but you're also creating that equilibrium with the potential audience. Are you finding that this campaign has any celebratory quality to it the way, a lot of political functions do, or does the pandemic just hover over all of it?
Honestly, I kind of feel like the pandemic is hovering over it. When I ran in 2018, I ran for Utah House District 5, and we went to 10 parades, and we were able to meet with people. And I felt like it was a really positive experience, and just connecting person to person.
Mm-hmm.
This time around, it is a more celebratory feeling, but it's kind of gone to the online format. And so it's a little bit more difficult to connect, I think, sometimes with people because
Mm-hmm.
it's more digital. But then we also can get some good feedback from the social media space too. So that's a good thing.
So you're talking about soliciting some maybe more honest feedback through Facebook and through social media from people that you're campaigning for. Have you seen some surprises in terms of what you're getting in terms of feedback?
Yeah, I think we issued a survey. We put it out on social media and on our campaign page to ask voters what are your concerns. And there's been a lot of concern about education and kids going back to school. Will the teachers be safe? There's been concern in Utah about testing times for the COVID-19 testing. There's been concern about the economy. We met with one business owner that is teetering on the brink of closure, and things were going great before the pandemic hit. And so I think what the pandemic has done is taken people, all of our kind of false narratives and kind of our outer shell of who we are, and reduced us to who we really are, which I think that's a positive thing. Really helps us discover what our real true values are, and what is really important to us, and also thinking about all of the social justice actions that people are taking in a positive ways. I don't support like destruction of property or human life, but I think the pandemic has forced all of us to do some self-analysis and decide who we are, what do we want out of society, what can I do, what can we do to help create the change that we want to see in society and the world. So I think from that perspective, I think the pandemic is a positive thing.
Yeah, well said. A few of my guests have been college professors and teachers, and they've talked about how, in some ways, the campus can be a bit of an equalizer in the sense that everyone is sharing a space together. But when you're doing a lot of your work online, on Zoom, even if it's a group class or if it's an individual, that can be very exposing in some ways. Have you seen that this amount of online campaigning has maybe gotten some things unstuck in the sense of like people are willing to be even more honest with you? I mean, one of the things I'm thinking of is that I've read that gender roles in meetings have been disrupted by Zoom meetings because everyone's a little bit more on equal footing. Have you seen any kind of isms get trampled by this more democratized technology?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's been a good thing. I've participated in meetings with the different organizations that I'm associated with, and I feel like people are a little more honest. And in our campaign Facebook Live conversations that we've had with different people, we got emotional. Chris and I both got emotional with Darlene McDonald, who was our first guest, talking about racial justice and Black Lives Matter, and how can we help minority communities? How can we, balance that with law enforcement, and how can we come together and solve these problems? And so I think there's been some, just like the pandemic has forced me and others to really analyze ourselves. I think the online format and Zoom kind of exposes us, who we are. And I think that can be a good thing too.
So, every city in America face some form of protest and some uprising, and you made the point that perhaps you made it into the living rooms or whatever of people, thousands of people you might not normally have met. What are some of the things that have surfaced in terms of, from meeting with those folks and maybe some of the organizers of those events? What are some of the things that have surfaced that you didn't know before?
Well, I was able to go to the Navajo Reservation Memorial Day weekend to help deliver supplies in conjunction with Devin Thorpe, who's running for Congress, and some Rotary clubs across the state. And before the pandemic, I didn't know. I mean, I had heard that there wasn't running water and electricity on part of the Navajo Reservation, but that experience combined with reaching out to Sahar Kajanuri, who works with the Utah Navajo Health System and is doing relief work down there, and then coming together with her and speaking about that and sharing it with that, people that can watch it over and over. They don't have to watch it just right when we're interviewing her. They can watch it anytime from our campaign page. That has been a powerful experience, kind of highlighting the inequities that we have and the problems that we face as a society. That has been really enlightening and helpful.
Do you think that people are getting the sense that government has more of a role to play in the well-being of society? I mean, I say that to be, it sounds a little bit flippant, but I mean it to be that in this thing where we really are a commonwealth. And I just wonder, as you're out there talking to people, does it seem like people are taking the role of the state more seriously?
I think so. I think people are realizing how important it is to have leadership. Mm-hmm. And positive leadership, and when we don't have positive leadership, what is the result? It's a painful result of what negative or ineffective leadership creates. And so realizing that our public health depends on effective government, our postal service depends on effective government, clean water and electricity on the Navajo Nation, so many things, our economy. That's why it's so important to have effective leaders in office, and that's why it's so important for us to vote and to analyze the candidates, and for other people to come forward that might not be in the traditional mold of politicians as usual, to come forward and to run for office.
Do you think that some politicians, particularly the ones that maybe aren't household names outside of their districts or outside of their state, have they maybe not done the best job in making a case for the importance of government? I mean, is that something that you see yourself as wanting to rectify?
Well, I think sometimes people, especially people that consider themselves like extremely conservative, have a tendency to want limited government, and they don't want that government interference in every part of their life. So I think, especially in the West, because we live in Utah, we come up against the Wild West mentality of kind of don't tell me what to do is kind of prevalent. And so I feel like that's a role that I can help play, and especially helping women see the importance of registering to vote and voting and being involved and engaged in the decision-making process. I think that's really important. They did a study in 2018 that showed that there were 316,000 Utah women who are residents but not registered to vote. That is something that can be improved in Utah too.
So we are celebrating the 100th year of women's suffrage, and that's something you've been very active in celebrating and bringing that awareness. Utah was the first state in the union it was actually in the union at the time, was the first territory to grant women's suffrage. It was taken away summarily, but I want to know about how you got involved in public life, in public service, and I want to know a little bit about how you see expanding the democratic process. So voter registration, bringing more folks in. Tell me about your story and what your ambitions are for yourself and for other women in the state.
Oh, thank you. Well, what drew me into politics was my mother. She passed away in the healthcare coverage gap in 2013. And after she passed away, I was frustrated and angry with myself and with the system. And I was just kind of fuming about it for several years. And then I read in the paper, the Utah newspapers, about health plan that was being proposed that was Utah's version of Medicaid expansion. And I thought it would be a good idea to share my support for that legislation with all of the legislators, Utah legislators. So I emailed all of them, couple of them got back with me. One of them called me, and I asked him how I could get more involved, because at that point I was just going off of a feeling and concern for people that could be in similar situations to my mother. So he told me how to get more involved, and so through learning from other legislators, from learning from nonprofits and learning from people in the Utah Democratic Party, I learned how to become a more effective advocate. And I felt this call to be involved with projects and opportunities and community work outside of my immediate family and neighborhood and church community. And so I continued to stay engaged and involved, and realized that I needed to get more organized, especially after that Healthy Utah plan didn't pass. And over the past several years, I was committed to being more organized and engaged, especially after I got an email from an organization after that Medicaid expansion plan didn't pass, saying, we did it. We knocked on all these doors. We called all these legislators, and we defeated this plan. And I couldn't believe that there was an organization out there doing that to defeat something that I thought could help people. And so that's when that thought came to me, that you need to get more organized and you need to get more engaged like they are. And so it was kind of a wake-up call for me. I was invited to be one of the 5 citizen sponsors of Proposition 3, which was a ballot initiative to expand Medicaid in Utah. And we gathered signatures for that statewide. It ended up getting enough signatures for it to be on the ballot, and it passed with the majority vote in 2018. The Utah legislature wanted to kind of redo it, and they created some proposals to submit to the federal government in the form of waivers, so they could change different elements of the ballot initiative. But ultimately, those waivers didn't pass, and the ballot initiative went to almost the original form of what the voters voted for. And so now approximately 100,000 Utahns are eligible for Medicaid in Utah. And as of just a couple years ago, that wasn't the case. Older Utahns that were single, weren't disabled and didn't have children at home, they couldn't have qualified for Medicaid. So it's a big positive experience and inspiring experience for me to go from having that feeling of frustration and anger and wanting to do something about a problem, to getting involved, to being one of the sponsors of a ballot initiative, and to seeing it pass, and knowing that thousands of people that could be in similar situations like my mother could get Medicaid.
Can you give me some of the nuts and bolts when you say get organized? I mean, I think I know what you mean, but could you give me something about, if you were going to tell somebody on the street that had this sort of vague and gnawing feeling about a problem, and you said, well, get organized, what did that actually look like to the man or woman on the street?
Thank you for asking that question. That's a good question. So what I did, the nuts and bolts of what I did after I had that thought, you need to get more organized, was I joined the Utah, I went to caucus night in early 2016. Before that, I had signed up this Utah Republican legislator who called me back. I asked him, what can I do to get involved? He said, get connected with Utah Health Policy Project, which is a nonprofit. Get on their email list. So I contacted them. I got on their email list so I could know what was going on in Utah related to healthcare legislation and policy. So that was the first step. And through my connection with them, with Utah Health Policy Project, I knew that they needed people to come and testify at a meeting at the Capitol building, Social Services Appropriations Committee meeting. And so I was aware of that opportunity, and I asked them, hey, would it be appropriate for me to go? And I could share the story about my mom. And so I did. So in early 2016, I went and testified at that meeting. There were about 55 of us that testified in support of Medicaid expansion, including, social workers, physicians, nonprofit leaders. And I was so nervous and emotional, and I could only speak, they cut the time down to 1 minute. I could only speak for a minute. And I had a picture of me and my mom when I was a baby, and me and my mom like a month before she died. And I was the only person with visual aids. And I was kind of a nervous wreck. But I think that was kind of the start for me the next step of taking action was going to that meeting, even though I was nervous, even though I didn't really know what to say completely. It was important that I was there. And also I realized at that time that I was the only one in the room, one of the few people in the room that wasn't getting paid to be there. Mm-hmm. And before that, I felt kind of powerless and like, what can I do? And then I realized when I was in that meeting, I can do a lot because I don't have to answer to a boss. I don't have to answer to anyone. I can just share my own thoughts and feelings. And then I thought, wow, this is an amazing feeling. And people were surprised that I was there, but they were very welcoming and helpful too. So from that experience, like a month later, I think I was in a press conference because I got connected to another nonprofit organization, Alliance for a Better Utah. I was in a press conference about Medicaid expansion. And then I shared the story of my mother, and there were several other people in the room that shared their stories too. Great advocates and great people. And so people have been working on this issue, this problem in Utah for a long time. So I was able to learn from them. So learning from these nonprofits, learning from other advocates. And also, after that press conference, I was able to meet several people at the Capitol that were really inspiring leaders and mentors for me. One of them, Jan Foray, is a active LDS Democrat. And I met her, and at that point I was honestly a registered Republican. And I didn't know, because of my cultural upbringing, that you could really be a active LDS woman and be a Democrat. I was like, wow, this is new. And just my concerns about healthcare, about education funding and different things made me realize that I needed to switch over and register as a Democrat, especially if I'm fighting for Medicaid expansion. And so that's what I did. And then in the spring of 2016, with the caucus night, I decided to go to the Democratic caucus night, and I had never been to a caucus night with the Democratic Party. And I decided that I wanted to be a county and state delegate. And I thought, I'm going to run for this because that's how I could be more organized, right? And be more engaged. So I did. I ran for that night, and I got elected. And so I've served as, a county and state delegate since that time. I told them I really want to make a change and have an impact in healthcare. And so they voted for me, and I was really excited about the opportunity. So that was another lesson to me of taking the opportunities that we have to be citizens. Like, I took the opportunity to go to the Capitol. I mean, it cost me, my time and some money, gas money. But we have those opportunities as citizens to contribute, and we are welcome in those spaces. I felt welcome in that space, even though I was a newcomer and I was nervous. I felt welcome in the space of going to the caucus night, even though I'd never done it before, and it was a new experience, and I was nervous too. So I also, after that experience, I went to the state convention, and I joined the Democratic Healthcare Caucus. And I volunteered to be their secretary because, again, this is getting more organized. And I realized we needed to get our email lists organized and automated. I put them all into MailChimp. I contributed to our Facebook group, which they already had, but I was really organized at our meetings and getting people to sign up, at the state convention. The last several legislative sessions, we've been there at least several times during the legislative session, meeting, discussing bills and legislation. And so that was really important to me. And also learning from those older people that were in our Democratic Healthcare Caucus group that they have been working on advocacy issues and passionate about different things for years and years. There's people out there that have been working on social justice issues for decades. And so taking the time to learn from people that were different than me, that were older than me, maybe younger than me, has been a good learning opportunity. So I continue to do my volunteer work in that Democratic Healthcare Caucus and as a delegate, following what was going on with healthcare in Utah. And then in late 2017, I was approached and asked if I would consider being one of the 5 sponsors of Proposition 3 to expand Medicaid. And I was so honored because I was the only, what I would call regular person out of the 5 people. One was the director of AARP of Utah. One was Beth Armstrong of the People's Health Clinic in Park City. One was Senator Brian Chiazawa, who's an emergency room physician and Republican state senator. And then another one was Reverend Scott Hayashi of the Episcopal Diocese of Utah. And then there was me. So that was a big, an amazing honor for me, because I developed the paperwork with my name and address, and we turned it into the Lieutenant Governor's office officially. And again, going from me having that feeling of, I'm so frustrated and angry about that my mom died, what can I do to help things be better? Mm-hmm. To having that feeling, to signing papers to actually make a difference and do something about it, has been an amazing experience for me. And that's why I'm so involved. That's why I'm so passionate about civic engagement. I'm passionate about being a citizen advocate, because I think we can make a difference. We can change the world. We can change America, because it takes more of us working together and doing things in positive ways to create change. And I know that we can do it. I know it has a good effect. So we didn't know if we would get enough signatures for it to be on the ballot. There were 3 ballot initiatives in 2018, but they all got enough signatures to get on the ballot. And then it passed with a majority vote, with 53% of the vote. And during that time, I also ran for office for Utah House District 5, and I announced my candidacy in March 2018, and I didn't win, but it was a great experience. And so through my campaigning in that race, I was able to share that I was a Proposition 3 sponsor, Medicaid expansion, and people of all different political backgrounds would tell me, of course, I support that. Why wouldn't I want to help my neighbor? And so that was a really good experience. But even after I lost in 2018, I thought, what can I do as a regular person, as a regular citizen, to make a difference? So I received even more opportunities after I lost in 2018 to be involved in the community. I had been a board member for the Friends of the Children's Justice Center, and I became the president of that organization in late 2018. And I also was invited to be a member of the Cache Valley Chamber of Commerce Board of Directors and co-chair of their Legislative Affairs Committee, and then also invited to be the co-chair of the Cache Celebration of Women's Suffrage 2020 organization. And I'm also a planning commissioner for the city of Nibley now. So those have been great opportunities for me. And something else that I recently started was I was invited to be a board member for Logan Regional Hospital. Now I participate in that service too. So that's been a great opportunity.
Was there a point when you're self-described as a regular person, and is there a point where you had this maybe 2 divergent paths you could take? One would have been in nonprofit work and one nonprofit advocacy, and then or take the path that you have, which is elected official. I mean, my question is it sounds like you were caught up in the excitement of the process and the empowerment of the process, and maybe just getting to be around such incredibly interesting people that you described. Is that why you veered towards the political side versus the nonprofit side?
Well, I think I veered towards the political side because I've received some encouragement from people within the Democratic Party, both locally and at the state level. I think if people weren't supportive of me running for office or encouraging me to do it, I'm not sure if I would be as willing to do it. Honestly, when I ran in 2018, I was invited or encouraged by the chair of the Cache Democrats. And when I accepted this opportunity to run as Lieutenant Governor candidate, I was approached first by a former state senator who thought that this would be a good opportunity for me and I would be good at it. So I think having those mentors and allies has been important for me. If I didn't have those political mentors and allies, then I don't think I would be as willing to do it. Mm-hmm. But I think the reason too is that I think it's important is that when you're in elected office, you can help influence policy and budgets. And you can do that too in the nonprofit world. But I think there needs to be more voices at the table and different perspectives when policies are decided on, when budgets are created. And so that's why I think I've decided to go the political route for now.
So you were mentioning the 19th Amendment celebration and the committee that you serve on in Cache County. Here in Rochester, one of our most famous citizens is Susan B. Anthony, and she made it out to Utah as an observer to observe women's suffrage in its earliest forms. And we premiered a new work this year about that by the amazing composer Gemma Peacock. And then the other organization I work for in the summertime in Santa Cruz, we also commissioned a new work by Stacey Garrop, composer from Chicago, about women's suffrage. I want to know what that period in history means to you, and how does it inform you as you talk about getting citizens more engaged? I was listening to the former, what was her title? The UN ambassador, Samantha Power, and she referred to what we're going through globally right now as a democratic recession, a small d democratic recession, after a period of democratic expansion. And so I think we're feeling this, I think you alluded to this a little bit early in the conversation, we're feeling a little bit of retrenchment of the democratic process, even in our own country. And I want to know how that period in history, those early pioneers, literally in your case in Utah, but I mean the democratic pioneers, how does that history inform the work you do now?
Well, I think personally, I'm a first generation woman voter, female voter in my family, because my father's mother, my grandmother, thought my grandfather should vote for her, and she was born in 1922. So she thought, if there's any voting that needs to be done, Grandpa, he'll just do it. I don't need to vote. Mm-hmm. And then my mother was from Finland, and she didn't become a citizen until 2 years before she passed away. So I'm sure my Finnish grandmother voted in Finland, but I didn't see my mother, voting. She was active in politics and knowing what was going on, but she didn't vote herself really most of her adult life. And so having this suffrage anniversary coming up for me is really significant, especially when you think about how short that time period is. 100 years isn't that long ago, especially when I think my grandmother was born in 1922 and she didn't vote because she thought my grandpa should. And so I think it's really important for women and for others to realize the civic privileges that we have and the opportunities that we have to contribute and to use our voice and vote.
So tell me about the Equal Rights Amendment that you're working on now.
Well, there's a Utah ERA coalition that has been working on this for the last several years. And so I reached out to one of the leaders in that organization to learn more from her what the progress is of the Equal Rights Amendment ratification in Utah, to kind of give our support for that. And so they have signed on to like a legal brief in Washington. I know that Representative John Curtis and I think Representative Ben McAdams had approved or voted on delaying the deadline for the ERA. And so there is one representative that is in support. I think there's multiple representatives of support in Utah of the ERA. But there's also some opposition to ratification of the ERA in Utah. So, and that goes back decades. But it'll be interesting to see this legislative session. I think one or two, of course, Utah legislators will sponsor it, and we'll see what happens.
So you've talked a lot about your mom and your relationship with her and her struggles. Was she the one that started you on instruments?
Yeah. Well, both of my parents encouraged me to start playing the violin. I chose the violin, and they helped me, of course, because I was really young. I think I was 5 or 6 when I started with the Suzuki method in Missouri. And we moved around a lot. And so I quit taking lessons. I took lessons for a couple of years, and then we moved, and I didn't take lessons. And then I started up in junior high again and played through high school. So yeah, she was really supportive of me studying violin. And then I started taking private lessons again several years ago when my teenager was taking private lessons, and I never had private lessons. And so I was kind of jealous. I'm like, wait a second, she's taking private lessons. I want to take them too. And so I started studying with Rosemary Hatch, who used to be with the Houston Symphony. And then I was studied with John Knudsen, who's a professional violinist, for a while too. And I need to pick up the violin again because it's been hard with politics and everything pulling me. But yeah, it's been an important part of my life.
So if you didn't have any lessons, did you have musicians in the family or someone to kind of give you a little bit of coaching?
Well, I just had my junior high, orchestra and high school orchestras, teachers. So that was kind of it. But no, my dad played the cello when he was in junior high and high school. But my parents didn't coach me at all.
So what did you take away from that experience of learning an instrument? Did it seem like it complemented your schoolwork? Was it something completely separate? How did it fit in?
Well, it was an important part of my life because I played sports a little bit in junior high, but in high school I didn't play sports. And so that was like my sport. We had a good time. I am still friends. I'm friends with my orchestra teacher on Facebook, and he just posted, Bill Bitter, and he just posted a couple weeks ago, I'm going back to my 40th year of teaching. Yeah, I think it complemented my musical experience in school.
So was it playing with other people that grabbed you about it? And was that the really fun part of it?
I think so. I think playing with other people, I like that. It would be hard for me to be a piano player, because, you're just solo. That's why I like orchestra.
Did your mom play an instrument at all?
No, she didn't. But she always made sure to have classical music playing in the house.
Was that to encourage you, or is that just because that was her taste?
I think that was her taste. Plus, we didn't have a TV when I was growing up. And so we listened to a lot of music.
And it was all classical?
Well, she liked to play classical, but I would turn on like Prince and stuff like that.
So is that what you're so Prince was your jam?
well, all the other 80s music, and my sisters and I, we would make little dances, choreograph little dances to 80s, rock songs. But we like to listen to the radio. So
if you could think back and think about the lessons that you took away from playing an instrument, playing with other people, what are some of the things that maybe you took away from that experience? I'll fill in some blanks for you, Katrina. So I think about like when I see kids that excel or take music pretty seriously, I see some resilience, I see some confidence, I see teamwork, the benefits of deliberate practice. Were those things that you kind of picked up, even though maybe you weren't studying as seriously as you could have?
Yes, I think so. And also realizing the importance of valuing the part each of us has to play, literally in the orchestra, and, working together as a team, developing patience and discipline. I think those are all really positive.
And I assume those were values that you said were important for your own kids to have. So you got them started on music education.
Yes, that's right. And I also think music education is an important form of stress relief, and of course creativity. But I think music can ground us and get us through hard times.
Mm-hmm. What role, if any, do you see the state as having in promoting arts education and the arts in general? Right before our conversation, I just actually got off a call with some local Rochester arts folks and a guy who's running, Jeremy Cooney, who's running for the state house and here in New York, a Democrat, 56th district. Wonderful guy, long history in politics. And there's just so many great ideas on how to get state involvement in the arts. I know that this is sometimes maybe not everyone's cup of tea, but I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on what our public stakeholders can do for kids and promoting live events to bring people together.
Well, that's an important point. I think it's really important. In Utah, there's a Utah Cultural Alliance, and they are a nonprofit that oversees the arts in general in Utah, and they will give grades to different legislators. Like you get an A in supporting the arts and culture in Utah, you get a D. And so having that evaluation is important, and accountability is important. To prepare for this, I looked online, and there was a great fact sheet about Utah arts, and the funding and the jobs. And it's, for as of March 2020, it says that 4.3% of the state's GDP and 63,617 jobs are part of the Utah arts and culture sector. And so it's really important, but I think state government budgeted in fiscal year 2020 $5,333,000 to the Utah Division of Arts and Museums. And then the division also received $733,200 in federal NEA funds. And so in addition to that, 304 nonprofit organizations received direct grants totaling almost $1 million. So I think Utah has done a good job in funding. I mean, I think Utah could always do better, but in combination from funding from the government and foundations and grants, I think that arts and culture feel supported in Utah. And of course, the pandemic has been hard on the arts and music in Utah, just like it has everywhere else. But in Logan, where we live, there's multiple arts and cultural opportunities. The Utah Festival Opera and Musical Theater is located here, and our two youngest children have participated in those live performances and musicals over the last several years. Our son, Carl, was in Ragtime when he was only 9 years old. We've been able to have some great cultural experiences and musical experiences in Utah.
It's funny, you're the second guest you'll be my 12th. So second out of 12 that has lived and worked in Logan, Utah.
Okay.
Another guest who used to teach at the university.
Oh, cool.
University there. And yes, I know that Utah has a rich culture and cultural tapestry. And one of the things about living in the West, I lived in Arizona for a while, is that unlike where I grew up in the Northeast, and where I live now, is that these institutions that are around us, they kind of grew up slowly over time. And many of the larger organizations out West kind of were born out of thin air, right, in the early part of the 20th century through government support. They've become completely private enterprises now and nonprofits. But yes, there is a great history of support. And there's a great history of really early, like mid-1800s, music education in Utah and the West. So I'm curious about, what did you learn from the loss in 2018, the election loss? What did you take away from that experience, and what are you projecting going forward from that?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I learned that it's possible to have positive relationships with different people from the opposing party. I shouldn't say opposing, but from the other political party.
The loyal opposition.
I was able to, develop a good relationship with my opponent even. We had some positive experiences. We went to dinner with our spouses. He invited us after he won. And so that was a positive experience. It was good to be able to meet with different people that, because of my campaign, I challenged myself to reach out to more people. I was able to go to all of the city council meetings for all of the cities in my district and give a little speech and say hi to the mayor and the council members. And some of the fears that I had going into different situations were overcome because I realized my worst fears didn't come to pass. Like, people didn't laugh at me at church because I'm an LDS woman and a Democrat and I'm running for office. People didn't, make fun of me when I went to the city council meetings. They were appreciative that I came and took the time to do that, and that I was, showing up to their meeting. And, having those positive relationships with people from the Republican Party have been really important to me. And so after I lost, I thought, what can I do to still contribute, even though I'm not an elected official? And I figured out, hey, I can do a lot, even though I'm not an elected official. And I think there's a lot of grassroots movement and change that needs to come from regular citizens. And I think that grassroots change is important and valuable.
Yeah, I've been in the music business now almost 20 years. And I have seen that institutions like I've lived in Virginia, Phoenix, Louisville, Kentucky, Indianapolis, Indiana, and now Rochester, New York. And over that time, I've seen that these institutions have become more about community building. And it's not just orchestras, certainly. And I wouldn't even pretend that we are industry leader or arts industry leaders in this, but that the appetite for what you're describing in terms of collegiality, in terms of citizenship, is absolutely there. And it does seem wildly disconnected from sort of like the cable news caricature of politics. And I think that at the state level, at the local level, we can't really afford as to be that acrimonious with our neighbors. And I think that government and nonprofits in particular are places where we can really work and putting like those really superficial, even if they're deeply held. I mean, there can be deeply held disagreements over policy, disagreements over the direction of the country. But I think that the institutions that believe in universality, even if that's like a construct, but we believe in it, it's an ideal, we're trying to move towards it, can all work together a little bit more closely. Do you see government partnership, a willingness to partner with other nonprofits, other large institutions, be they publicly funded or privately funded, to create more of that like bridging and bonding experience we hear about in community building?
Yes, we've had a good example of this in Cache County on multiple levels. Well, with the Children's Justice Center, the Cache County attorney wants to increase the victim services for adult victims of crime. Right now, children that have been abused physically or sexually or in other ways go to the Children's Justice Center so they can get a forensic medical exam and an interview that can be presented in court, so they're less likely to go to court. The Cache County attorney wants to do the same thing for adult crime victims, to have a more trauma-informed way of taking care of them. He's a Republican, and I have a really good relationship with him. But the reason I bring it up is because Maloof Incorporated, they are a linens company in Nibley here in Cache Valley. They volunteered to partner with us to build a new building, to design it, to help do the fundraising. That's been put on hold because of the pandemic. But that willingness to partner with us to invest in community from the business perspective is invaluable, because there's a lot of things that we can do, with business that would take forever to do with government if we relied on the government. So I think those partnerships are still important. And the nonprofits partnering with government are important, especially when it comes to like prevention and other issues that are too difficult for government to handle. I think the nonprofits have an important role to play too. And so I think developing those relationships and not being so stuck within our own worlds or our own spheres that we don't reach out and branch out is not a good thing. I think it's important to have open communication, to not be stuck in our own silos, and to work together. And that's how we get the best outcome. Kind of like the orchestra that we're talking about, you're working together on the same goal and the same piece, even though, you're different instruments, different people. I think that's how government should work with, business, with nonprofits, with other organizations to create change and to have a positive community environment.
Yeah, it's a great point. And as I listen to you talk about this, I think on one hand, you could say that, well, you're a Democrat in Utah and you're in a minority party. And so it behooves you to work with your colleagues across the aisle. The other side, though, is that we're coming out of this national catastrophe. Hopefully we're coming out of this national catastrophe. And as we've talked a little bit about how maybe people rethink government, how they think about our shared resources, our communally owned investments that we have, how those things protect us, how we invest in them. What do you think the future of the Democratic Party is in the Mountain West and Utah in particular?
That's a great question. I think the Democratic Party, we need to get better at messaging on how the Democratic Party's values are family values. I think about my upbringing in an active LDS Latter-day Saint home, and I never heard anything positive about Democrats. I didn't hear anything positive about President John F. Kennedy. My mother told me never marry a Democrat. And so that's some of the things that I was brought up with that I think other people grew up with, just having the Democratic Party kind of has a negative image, I think, in the Intermountain West. And I don't know if it's because of the religious aspect, but also that freedom aspect of that people feel like the Democratic Party is out to control them, and they want their freedom. And so I think the Democratic Party has some great opportunities in the Intermountain West to reach out to voters and to message effectively so people can realize that the Democratic values are family values, and we want there to be a better economy. We want people to succeed, and we're here to support you.
And certainly in the major cities out there, though, you have hyper competent leadership at the city level and the big city levels, Phoenix, Denver, Salt Lake.
Right.
And I think I was a beneficiary of that. Watching the city of Phoenix change overnight when I lived there in the early 2000s. That Mayor Phil Gord at the time, but Kate Gallego, who's the mayor there now, I think she's got a huge future. Greg Stanton, who was the mayor there, is now in the House. But yeah, these Mountain West cities, they're in some ways, they're the best advertisements for the Democratic Party, and that they're so well run and they're booming, right? They're booming cities, and Salt Lake is certainly a booming city.
That's true. There's some lessons that can be learned from those Democratic led big cities in the West. That is true. Salt Lake City has a very, a thriving arts and cultural scene, restaurants, business, education. And so there's some great things happening.
Oh, it's an amazing city. I went there years and years, probably 20 years ago, and it was a very sleepy town. It was a small sample size, maybe one weekend I was there. And then I went back maybe 10 years ago on tour, when I was touring a touring show across the country. And I remember thinking, oh my God, what a cosmopolitan place this has become. And we were playing at the arena where the Jazz play. And so we were right in the center of town. And there was an amazing sushi restaurant across the street from my hotel. And then I've been back a few times to go skiing at Alta, and just amazed at what an amazing cosmopolitan, rich in culture place it's become. And another thing that's a little bit close to my heart is that one of the America's preeminent string making schools, so violin making schools, is in Salt Lake City. Some of the greatest instruments that are being made are coming out of Salt Lake. In fact, my wife has a violin that was made there in the early 2000s by a guy named John Young.
Awesome.
Yeah. Well, that's my sales pitch for your biggest city.
Yeah.
So before we wrap this up, Karina, again, I want to thank you for making time. I just want to hear a little bit, make your closing argument for your campaign and for your running mate, who by all accounts is a really remarkable guy. And I just want to hear your final words about the Peterson Brown ticket.
Well, thank you so much, Rob, for having me on today on your podcast. I think Chris's work in consumer protection and his commitment to helping vulnerable populations matches up with my commitment to helping vulnerable populations and my work in healthcare and Medicaid expansion. I think that's what's needed right now in Utah, because we already have support for, big business, and Utah has a lot of great things going on, but I think we can make Utah a more welcoming place for all and help provide more opportunities for all Utahns to succeed.
Fantastic. Karina, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. The music on this show, as always, is by Craig Wagner, an incredible guitarist from Louisville, Kentucky. We'll be back soon with more interviews. The next episode is with Quentin Morris, a Seattle-based violinist, educator, filmmaker, and entrepreneur. So please go ahead and hit subscribe.